The click of the receiver was soft, but in the silence of his workshop, it sounded like a closing latch on a cage. Leo held the phone to his ear for a moment longer, a habit from a time when connections were less certain. It was in that lingering silence that he heard her voice again, not muffled or distant, but clear and sharp, cutting through the atmosphere like a blade. "He has no idea what's coming next month," Clara said. Her voice was laced with a cruel amusement that was disturbingly familiar. He heard the clink of ice in a glass, then the deeper, smug tone of his brother-in-law, Richard. "The look on his face will be priceless," Richard replied, his laugh a low, rumbling thing. 10 years of playing house with a grease monkey. You deserve a medal, sis, and a very, very large check." Leo's hand tightened on the phone, the cheap plastic creaking in protest. He slowly, carefully lowered it from his ear, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He hadn't hung up. She had forgotten to end the call. It was a simple, careless mistake, but it had just detonated his entire world. For 10 years he had been the patient husband, the simple, hard-working man who loved a woman far above his station. He was Leo, the carpenter, the man with sawdust in his hair and calluses on his hands. She was Clara, the elegant, sophisticated woman who seemed to have been born in a ballroom. Their marriage had always been a puzzle to their social circle, a curiosity that was often the subject of whispered conversations at the lavish parties her family threw. He had always ignored the whispers. He had ignored the condescending smiles from her mother, the thinly veiled insults from her brother, and even the growing, icy distance from Clara herself. He had told himself it was the pressure of her world, a world of wealth and status he didn't understand. He had believed in his vows. He had believed in the memory of the girl he had fallen for a decade ago. But that single, overheard sentence shattered the foundation of his life. He has no idea what's coming next month. Next month was their 10th wedding anniversary. A day he had been quietly looking forward to, hoping it might mark a turning point, a return to the warmth they once shared. Now he saw it for what it was, a finish line, a deadline. He looked around his workshop, the one sanctuary he had in the sprawling estate they called home. Tools hung in perfect order on the walls. The scent of pine and cedar filled the air. This was his world, a world of tangible things, of creating and fixing. It was a world Clara and her family viewed with utter contempt. They saw it as dirty, as common, as beneath them. His eyes fell upon a small, ornate wooden box on his workbench. It was made of dark, polished cherry wood with intricate silver inlays. His grandfather had given it to him just before he passed away, a week before Leo's wedding. The old man's hands, gnarled with age but still strong, had pressed it into his. "Don't open it until your 10th anniversary, Leo," his grandfather had said, his voice a low rasp. "A decade is a good measure of a man, of a marriage too. Everything you need to know will be in here." Inside, a small, antique key rattled against the wood. Attached to it was a simple folded piece of paper with a name written in his grandfather's spidery script, Arthur Thompson. Leo had always thought of it as a sentimental gesture, a final, eccentric gift from the man who had raised him. He had respected the old man's wishes, leaving the box untouched for nearly 10 years. Now the box seemed to pulse with a dark energy. It was no longer a symbol of his grandfather's love, but a piece of the cruel puzzle Clara had just laid bare. What was coming next month? What did this box have to do with it? The check Richard had mentioned echoed in his mind, a venomous, greedy sound. A cold resolve began to form in the pit of his stomach, displacing the shock and the hurt. For 10 years, He had been the sleeping giant, the patient victim. He had endured their scorn, their mockery, their cold indifference. He had played the part of the simple, oblivious husband they wanted him to be. He picked up the small wooden box. The weight of it felt different now, heavier, more significant. He ran his thumb over the silver inlay, the metal cool against his skin. They thought he had no idea. They thought he was a fool. For the first time in a decade, Leo decided he would stop playing their game and start learning the rules of his own. The investigation had begun. The days that followed were a masterclass in deception. Leo moved through his life with a placid exterior, a calm mask that concealed the raging storm within. He fixed the squeaky hinge on the library door. He repaired a loose stone on the patio. He performed the small, useful tasks that had defined his role in the household, all while his mind raced, connecting dots he had never seen before. Clara, for her part, became almost unbearably cheerful. She hummed as she read fashion magazines by the pool. She spoke of the grand anniversary party she was planning, her words dripping with a false sweetness that now made Leo's skin crawl. "It has to be perfect, darling," she said one evening, looking up from a glossy brochure for a catering company. "A celebration of 10 wonderful years. All of our friends will be there. You must wear that lovely blue suit I bought you." He knew the suit she meant. It was 2 sizes too big, a deliberate choice to make him look oafish and ill-suited to her glamorous world. He had always thought it was just a mistake, a misjudgment of his size. Now he understood it was a costume for the role she had cast him in, the fool. "Of course, honey," he said, his voice even. "Whatever you think is best." Her smile was a brief, dismissive flash. "Good. I'll handle everything. You just focus on, well, whatever it is you do in that shed of yours." That shed was where he spent every spare moment, not with wood and nails, but with his laptop. He started with the name from his grandfather's note, Arthur Thompson. A quick search revealed an old, prestigious law firm in the city's financial district, Thompson, Finch and Associates. The firm specialized in estate planning and complex trusts. He felt a jolt, a spark of connection. His grandfather had been a simple man, a master carpenter himself. What business would he have with a firm that managed the fortunes of the city's elite? It didn't make sense. Unless, of course, the story Leo had been told his entire life was a lie. He remembered his childhood, a modest but comfortable upbringing. His grandfather had provided for him after his parents were gone. They never wanted for anything, but they never lived in luxury. The old man preached the gospel of hard work, of earning your place, of the quiet dignity in a job well done. He had despised flashy displays of wealth, calling them a sucker's game. Meanwhile, Clara and Richard lived as though money were an infinite resource. Leo had always assumed it was from the Ashton family fortune, a storied inheritance he had been told about, but never seen the details of. They lived in a sprawling mansion, drove cars that cost more than the house he grew up in, and treated $1,000 dinners as a casual Tuesday night affair. Their arrogance was built on this foundation of wealth. They saw the world as a hierarchy, and they were firmly at the top. People like Leo, people who worked with their hands, were at the bottom, necessary perhaps like plumbing or electricity, but certainly not their equals. He had sat through countless dinners where Richard pontificated about his investments, and Clara mocked the tacky choices of some acquaintance who had dared to buy a car that wasn't a European luxury brand. Their confidence was absolute. They believed they were untouchable, their position secured by a birthright of money and status. They moved through the world with the serene assurance of people who had never been told no. This overconfidence was now their greatest vulnerability. They couldn't conceive of a world where Leo, the simple carpenter, could ever pose a threat. He was a piece on their board, not a player. He booked an appointment with Arthur Thompson, giving a false name. He couldn't risk anything tipping off Clara. The appointment was for the following week. Until then, he had to continue the charade, to be the loving, oblivious husband she expected him to be. That weekend, Clara hosted a small brunch. Richard was there, of course, along with a few of their sycophantic friends. Leo was expected to play the role of the silent, slightly awkward husband. He stood by the barbecue, grilling salmon, while Richard held court by the pool. "The market's about to make a major move," Richard announced loudly, swirling a glass of champagne. "For those of us in the know, the next month is going to be transformative." He caught Leo's eye and gave a small, conspiratorial wink, a gesture of such profound condescension it took all of Leo's willpower not to throw his tongs down and walk away. Clara drifted over to him, her smile as bright and hard as a diamond. "Everything all right, darling? You seem a bit quiet." "Just thinking," Leo said, flipping a piece of fish. "Don't strain yourself," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear, before turning back to her friends with a peal of laughter. The humiliation was a familiar fire, but this time it didn't burn him. It forged his resolve into something cold and hard. They were so busy looking down on him that they never thought to look at the ground beneath their own feet. They had no idea it was about to give way. And he was the one who was going to pull the lever. The office of Thompson, Finch, and Associates was a world away from the sterile glass and steel towers that dominated the city's skyline. It was housed in an old stone building with a heavy oak door that opened into a lobby of hushed reverence. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and polish. Leo gave his real name to the receptionist, and a moment later a man who seemed as ancient as the building itself emerged from a back office. He was tall and thin, with a shock of white hair and eyes that were a startlingly sharp blue. He wore a perfectly tailored three-piece suit that looked like it had been in style half a century ago and had decided to remain there. "Mr. Miller," the man said, his voice a dry rustle, "I am Arthur Thompson. I have been expecting you for quite some time, as a matter of fact." He led Leo into a vast book-lined office. A large mahogany desk sat before a window that overlooked a quiet courtyard. Mr. Thompson gestured for Leo to sit, then settled into his own high-backed leather chair. "Your grandfather was a very particular man," Thompson began, folding his hands on the desk, "and a very, very wise one. He set in motion a plan nearly 10 years ago, a plan of which you are the centerpiece." Leo felt a tremor of anticipation. He placed the small wooden box on the desk between them. "My grandfather told me to open this on my 10th anniversary. I haven't. But I need to know what this is all about." Mr. Thompson smiled, a faint, knowing expression. "Your grandfather, Leo, was not the simple carpenter you believed him to be. That was a part of who he was, yes. It was the part he valued most, but it was not the whole story." He leaned forward, his blue eyes locking onto Leo's. "Your grandfather, Robert Miller, was one of the most brilliant and secretive investors of his generation. He built an empire from nothing. He believed that great wealth was a corrupting influence, a poison that rotted the soul. He saw what it did to people, so he lived modestly and kept his fortune hidden through a labyrinth of trusts and shell corporations." Leo sat in stunned silence. He tried to reconcile the image of his grandfather, a man in dusty overalls, smelling of sawdust and coffee, with the idea of a corporate titan. It was impossible. "The total value of his estate is substantial," Thompson said with colossal understatement. He left it all to you, Leo, but with one very important condition. He created what he called the Decade of Character Trust. The lawyer explained the mechanism with meticulous precision. The entire fortune, a staggering sum that made Leo feel dizzy, was locked away. For 10 years, Leo had to live a normal, humble life. He had to have a job, pay his bills, and exist without any knowledge of the immense wealth waiting for him. It was a test. His grandfather wanted to ensure that the man who inherited his empire had a character forged by work and integrity, not by privilege. On the day of your 10th wedding anniversary, Thompson continued, the trust matures. Full control of all assets transfers to you unconditionally. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture that was both brilliant and monstrous. "And the Ashtons?" Leo asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Clara? Richard? Where do they fit in?" A flicker of distaste crossed Mr. Thompson's features. "Ah, the Ashtons. Your grandfather had a history with them. Clara's father was once Robert's business partner, a partnership that ended when Robert discovered he was embezzling millions. Your grandfather quietly ruined him, but he didn't leave the family destitute. He was a hard man, but not a cruel one." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Years later, when Robert was setting up your trust, he learned that the Ashtons were on the brink of total collapse. Their family name was all they had left. So he made them a proposition. A cruel one, perhaps, but one he felt was a fitting irony." Leo felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew what was coming. "He offered them a lifeline," Thompson said, his voice flat. "A one-time payment of $10 million, enough to restore their family's standing. But it came with a condition. His only grandson, you, was about to be married. The Ashtons' daughter, Clara, was to be your wife. She had to remain married to you for the full 10 years of the trust's probation period. If she did, on the day the trust matured, her family would receive their payment. It was all there, the whole sordid, transactional truth. His marriage wasn't a marriage, it was a business deal, a 10-year prison sentence for Clara, with a $10 million payout at the end. She hadn't married a man, she had married a contract. They were never told about your inheritance," Thompson added. "They believed the entire arrangement was about them, a final, eccentric test from the man who had ruined them. They thought you were just a pawn in their story of restoration." The final, devastating piece of the puzzle slotted into place. "The house," Leo said, his mind reeling. "The cars, the clubs, their entire lifestyle." "Paid for by a preliminary allowance from your trust," Thompson confirmed. "A fund set up to maintain the lifestyle Clara was accustomed to ensure she wouldn't break the contract out of sheer frustration. They've been living on your money, Leo. For 10 years, they have been living on your money, all while treating you as if you were dirt beneath their shoes." The irony was so profound it was almost comical. Their immense pride, their social standing, their condescending superiority, it was all a facade, funded by the very man they despised. They were birds in a gilded cage, and he held the key. He had held it all along, rattling inside that small wooden box. The initial shock began to subside, replaced by a feeling Leo had never experienced before. It was a chilling, absolute clarity. The hurt was still there, a deep, resonant ache for the decade he had wasted, for the love he had believed in. But it was being rapidly overtaken by a cold, righteous anger. He looked at Mr. Thompson, his expression hardening. The sleeping giant was awake, and he was furious. "Tell me everything," Leo said, his voice low and steady. "Tell me about every account, every asset, every legal string I can pull. The party is in 2 weeks. I want their world to be dismantled piece by piece, and I want the final screw to turn right in the middle of her celebratory toast." Mr. Thompson allowed himself another small, grim smile. "With pleasure, Mr. Miller, with absolute pleasure." The plan they devised in that dusty, book-lined office was a masterpiece of surgical destruction. It wasn't about crude revenge, it was about justice, delivered with the cold, impersonal precision of a legal document. They would use the Ashtons' own greed and arrogance as the weapon against them. The first step was for Leo to formally accept his position as the sole beneficiary of the trust. Mr. Thompson slid a thick stack of papers across the mahogany desk. Leo signed each one, his signature firm and clear. With each stroke of the pen, he felt a layer of his old self, the patient, accommodating husband, fall away. The man who left that office was not the same one who had entered. The strategy was simple, a slow, agonizing squeeze, followed by a sudden, catastrophic collapse. They would let the anniversary party proceed. It would be the stage for the final act, the grand finale of the Ashtons' decade-long performance. "They are over-leveraged in every conceivable way," Thompson explained, pointing to a complex flowchart of the Ashtons' finances. "Richard's so-called investment firm is a sham, funded entirely by a business loan guaranteed by an asset management company that is, in fact, a subsidiary of your trust. Clara's credit lines for her shopping and party planning are secured against the deed to the house, a house which, of course, the trust owns outright. Every pillar of their lavish life was built on a foundation of sand, and Leo now controlled the tide. The decision was made, the documents were signed, the plan was in motion. Leo returned home that evening, the weight of his newfound knowledge a heavy cloak around his shoulders. Clara was in the living room, barking orders at a florist on the phone about centerpieces.
"No, no, not peonies. They're so common," she snapped. "I want white orchids, hundreds of them, and I don't care what they cost." She hung up and turned to Leo, her eyes scanning him with the usual faint disapproval. "You look tired, dear." "It was a long day," he said, his voice a perfect imitation of his usual weary tone. "Well, try to rest up," she said, her attention already drifting back to her party planning checklist. "I need you to be presentable for our big night. It's terribly important. Terribly important." He had no idea how right she was. The first quiet step was taken the next morning. On Leo's instruction, Mr. Thompson made a single phone call. He contacted the bank that held the loan for Richard's firm, informing them, as the guarantor's legal representative, that a full audit of the asset portfolio would be required before any further extensions of credit. He didn't cancel anything, he simply initiated a process.
A bureaucratic, time-consuming, and utterly terrifying process for someone with something to hide. The first domino had been tipped. Now all Leo had to do was wait for it to fall. The first crack in the Ashtons' perfect facade appeared 3 days before the party. Leo was in his workshop, sanding a piece of oak, when he heard Richard's sports car tear up the gravel driveway. The engine cut out abruptly, and a moment later the door to the main house slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows. Leo stayed put, listening. The shouting started almost immediately. Richard's voice was high and panicked, Clara's a sharp, defensive screech. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Pure, unadulterated panic. Later that evening, Clara approached him by the pool. Her face was tight, the smile she wore as brittle as glass. "Richard is having some business trouble," she said, trying for a casual tone. "Some dreadful bureaucratic mix-up. It's put him in a foul mood." "I'm sorry to hear that," Leo said, his voice dripping with feigned sincerity. "Is there anything I can do?" Her laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Of course not, darling. What could you possibly do? It's all very complex financial stuff, way over your head." The condescension was so automatic, so deeply ingrained, that she couldn't see the supreme irony of what she was saying. She was asking the fish for help with her drowning. The next domino fell the following day. Clara went on a pre-party shopping spree, a ritual of celebratory excess. She returned home hours later, her face a mask of cold fury. She stormed into the kitchen where Leo was making a sandwich and threw her purse onto the marble island. "My card was declined," she hissed, her voice low and venomous, "at Cartier, in front of everyone. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" Leo chewed his sandwich thoughtfully. "Maybe it's just a mistake. Did you call the bank?" "Of course I called the bank," she snapped. "They said something about a security hold on the account. They said the primary account holder had to call to clear it. It's ridiculous." The primary account holder. Leo almost smiled. Mr. Thompson had been busy. A simple flag on the account, a minor inconvenience that to someone like Clara was a public execution of her status. He pulled out his own worn leather wallet. "Here," he said, offering her his modest low-limit credit card. "You can use this if you need it." She stared at the card as if he had offered her a dead rat. The look of pure disgust on her face was more satisfying than he could have imagined. "Don't be absurd, Leo." The cascade was beginning. The day before the party, the caterer called, then the florist, then the band. Their deposits hadn't cleared. They all demanded payment in full, up front, before they would render their services. The Ashtons' river of money had suddenly run dry. The panic in the house was a palpable thing. Richard and Clara spent hours on the phone, their voices a rising tide of desperation and disbelief. They tried to move money from one account to another, only to find them frozen. They tried to extend their lines of credit, only to be politely but firmly refused. Leo watched it all from a serene distance. He tidied his workshop. He read a book in the garden. He was an island of calm in their hurricane of chaos. They were so consumed by their own crisis that they barely noticed him, which was exactly as he had planned. They managed to scrape together enough money to pay for the party, draining the last of their personal savings, cashing in some stocks Richard had in his own name. They were determined to see this through, to put on one last show of their wealth and power. They were convinced this was all a temporary, albeit infuriating, setback. They still believed their $10 million payday was just around the corner. They were marching willingly toward the cliff's edge, their eyes fixed on a prize that was nothing but a mirage. The night of the party was a spectacle of desperate grandeur. Hundreds of white orchids filled the massive ballroom. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and impossibly small appetizers. To the untrained eye, it was the pinnacle of success, the celebration of a golden couple. But Leo could see the cracks. He saw the way Clara's smile didn't reach her eyes. He saw the sweat on Richard's brow as he glad-handed guests. They were actors in the final scene of a play, and they were terrified of the curtain falling. Leo wore the ill-fitting blue suit as requested. He looked exactly as they wanted him to look, harmless, out of place, a simple man bewildered by the splendor around him. He played his part perfectly, nodding politely to guests and staying on the periphery. Finally, the moment arrived. Clara stepped up to the small stage, tapping a glass for attention. The room fell silent. She beamed a radiant, false smile out at the crowd of her peers, the people whose approval she craved more than anything. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice smooth and practiced. 10 years. 10 years ago I married this man." She gestured toward Leo with a flourish. "A simple man, a good man. He has kept me grounded, taught me humility." A few sycophantic titters ran through the crowd. "It has been a journey," she continued, her eyes gleaming with unshed tears of sheer relief. that her sentence was almost over. But we made it, and now we are about to begin the next wonderful chapter of our lives. To the future, she raised her glass, Before anyone could drink, Leo was moving. He walked calmly to the stage and took the second microphone from its stand. A surprised murmur went through the room. Clara stared at him, her smile faltering, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "Thank you, Clara," Leo said, his voice calm and clear, amplified throughout the silent ballroom. "That was a beautiful speech. And you're right. We are about to begin a new chapter. But you seem to have fundamentally misunderstood the story we've been living." He turned to face the crowd. He felt 100 pairs of judgmental eyes on him, but for the first time he felt no intimidation. He felt nothing but a cold, clear power. "For 10 years, he said, his voice ringing with authority, "most of you have looked at me and wondered what a woman like Clara was doing with a man like me. You saw a carpenter, a laborer. You saw a man who didn't belong in your world, and you were right. I don't belong in this world, because this world, this house, the cars, the clothes, this very party, it's all a lie." A shocked gasp rippled through the audience. Clara's face had gone from annoyed to horrified. "Leo, what are you doing?" she hissed. He ignored her. "You all know the Ashtons as a family of old money and great prestige. What you don't know is that the Ashton fortune was lost long ago, squandered by poor decisions and, shall we say, unethical business practices." He glanced at Richard, whose face had turned a pasty white. "You see, this marriage was not a love story. It was a business contract, a deal struck with my grandfather. Clara had to stay married to me for 10 years. In exchange, her family would receive a payment of $10 million today on our anniversary." The room erupted in whispers. Clara looked as though she had been struck by lightning. "But that's the part of the story you knew," Leo continued, his voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. "Here's the part you didn't. Here's the part that even Clara and Richard didn't know. My grandfather wasn't just a carpenter. He was one of the wealthiest men in this country, and he left his entire fortune to me." He let that hang in the air for a moment. The silence was absolute, profound. "This entire time," Leo said, his gaze sweeping over Clara and Richard, "every luxury you have enjoyed, every party you have thrown, every single dollar you have spent to maintain this facade of superiority has been my money. You have been living in my house, driving my cars, and spending my inheritance, all while treating me like I was nothing." Clara finally found her voice. It was a raw, strangled shriek. "Liar! You're a liar! He's making it all up!" Richard started toward the stage, his face contorted with rage, but 2 large men in dark suits, security guards Leo had hired personally, materialized and blocked his path. "It's all true," Leo said calmly. He held up a single key, the key from his grandfather's box. "This is the key to my grandfather's safe deposit box. In it are the final documents, but the process is already in motion. The accounts are frozen, the assets are being transferred, the credit lines have been cut." He turned to Clara, his eyes devoid of any warmth. "You spent 10 years treating me like a stepping stone, a fool, an inconvenience you had to endure to get your paycheck. Well, the contract is fulfilled. You did your time. Your family will get their $10 million. I am a man of my word." A flicker of desperate hope appeared in her eyes. "But as for everything else," he said, his voice dropping to a final, devastating whisper, "it's over. The house, the cars, the club memberships, the accounts, they are all mine, and you are no longer welcome here. You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the premises." Clara's face crumpled. The sophisticated mask shattered, revealing the greedy, terrified woman beneath. She let out a guttural scream of pure, unadulterated rage and grief and lunged at him. The security guards intercepted her easily, holding her back as she thrashed and sobbed, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark streaks. Her perfect world had crumbled to dust in front of everyone she had ever tried to impress. Leo placed the microphone carefully back on its stand. He looked out at the sea of stunned, silent faces. Then he turned and walked off the stage, through the ballroom, and out the front door into the cool night air, never once looking back. He left the chaos and the ruin behind him. The chapter was closed. The aftermath was as swift and brutal as Leo had intended. The story of the Ashtons' public humiliation spread through their social circle like wildfire. Friends who had once flocked to their parties now crossed the street to avoid them. The illusion of their status was shattered, and without it, they were nothing. Their $10 million payment arrived as promised, but it was a poisoned chalice. As Mr. Thompson had anticipated, Richard's sham investment firm had been a ticking time bomb of tax fraud and illegal financial maneuvers. The IRS, already alerted by the audit, descended upon their newfound wealth with a vengeance. After armies of lawyers and accountants took their fees, and the government took its massive cut in back taxes and penalties, the Ashtons were left with a fraction of the original sum. It was enough to live on, but not enough to reclaim their former glory. They were forced to sell what little they had left and move to a modest suburban home, a public and permanent symbol of their spectacular fall from grace. They were no longer elite, they were cautionary tales. Leo, in stark contrast, did not embrace the lavish lifestyle he could now easily afford. He sold the monstrous mansion and all its opulent contents. He kept only his tools from the workshop. The vast fortune, he discovered, felt more like a responsibility than a prize. His grandfather had tested his character, and Leo was determined to honor that legacy. He established the Robert Miller Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to providing scholarships and grants to young people entering the skilled trades. He believed, as his grandfather had, in the dignity of work, in the value of creating something real and tangible with one's own hands. He bought a comfortable, unassuming house on a quiet, tree-lined street and converted the large garage into a state-of-the-art workshop. He spent his days there, not managing portfolios or attending board meetings, but doing what he had always loved, working with wood. He began teaching free carpentry classes to kids from the local community center, finding more joy in showing a teenager how to build a simple, sturdy bookshelf than he ever could have found at one of Clara's soulless parties. Months passed. The noise of his past faded into a quiet hum. One afternoon, a woman came to his workshop. She introduced herself as Anna, an architect working with the city on a new community park project. The Miller Foundation was one of the primary funders. She was there to review the plans for a series of custom-built benches and playground structures. She was bright, warm, and had an easy laugh. She looked at his calloused hands, not with disdain, but with a genuine respect. "I love what you're doing here," she said, looking around the sawdust-covered space. "It's real, it's honest." They talked for hours, first about blueprints and wood grains, and then about life, values, and what it meant to build something that lasts. For the first time in over a decade, Leo felt seen. He wasn't a role or a means to an end. He was just Leo. And that was enough. It was more than enough. In the end, Leo realized the profound truth of his grandfather's test. True wealth was never about the numbers in a bank account. It was about character. It was about integrity. It was about knowing your own worth, even when the world around you tries to tell you that you have none. The Ashtons had been obsessed with the appearance of wealth, and in their pursuit they had bankrupted their souls. They had grasped for money and status only to find them to be hollow and fleeting. Leo had been the richest man in the room all along, not because of a hidden trust fund, but because he knew the value of a hard day's work, the quiet satisfaction of a well-made thing, and the simple, profound peace of a life lived with honor. He had won more than just his freedom, he had won himself. And in a world of glittering lies, that was the only victory that truly mattered.